A quiet New England suburb, just shy of 13,000 residents in the early 1980s. It was the kind of place where people left their front doors unlocked and where Halloween decorations stayed up a few days too long because no one was in a rush. There were woods and winding back roads and a town green where kids played after school. It was peaceful, safe, predictable. But that peace was shattered in February 1981 when a man named Alan Bono was found dead on the floor of his apartment, stabbed multiple times in what looked like a sudden, unprovoked act of violence. His wounds were brutal. The attack had been quick, forceful, and fueled by something more than rage. Something primal. The man arrested was Arne Cheyenne Johnson, a 19-year-old local with no prior record, clean-cut, soft-spoken, and by most accounts, even-tempered. Arne had no history of violence. He worked as a tree surgeon, attended church, and lived with his girlfriend Debbie Glatzel, who had been present during the fatal altercation. So when police handcuffed Arne and asked why he'd done it, the answer was not what anyone expected. He said he didn't remember. And later, as investigators pressed for details, he claimed he'd been possessed. Not figuratively, not metaphorically, literally. He told authorities that something dark had taken control of him, not just during the murder, but for weeks leading up to it, and his family stood by him. They insisted that Arne had been battling a demonic force since the summer prior. They said it started when Debbie's younger brother, David Glatzel, just 11 years old at the time, began showing signs of possession, and that Arne, in an act of desperate defiance, had invited the demon into himself to save the boy. It sounded impossible, but it wasn't fiction. It was part of the official legal defense. For the first time in U.S. history, the not guilty by reason of demonic possession defense was about to be tested in a court of law. It began the summer before the murder. In July 1980, Arne and Debbie moved into a small rental house in Newtown, Connecticut. They were young, in love, and eager to start a life together. Debbie worked for a kennel, and Arne took up tree work, nothing glamorous, but enough to get by. When they moved in, they brought along David, Debbie's younger brother, to help settle the house. Almost immediately, David began to complain of strange visions. He spoke of a man with big black eyes, a figure with hooves instead of feet, and long, twisted features. The family initially chalked it up to nerves, maybe the stress of the move, maybe an overactive imagination. But then, David began waking up screaming. He said the man threatened to steal his soul. Soon, things escalated. David spoke in growling tones. He threw tantrums with abnormal strength for his age. Furniture moved on its own. Claw marks appeared on doors. He began having seizures and hallucinations. The family, deeply religious, turned to the church for help. But when medical tests revealed no neurological cause for David's symptoms, and when psychiatric evaluations failed to explain the extent of his behavior, they contacted Ed and Lorraine Warren, a well-known pair of paranormal investigators who had previously worked on the infamous Amityville case. The Warrens claimed that David was possessed. They said he wasn't mentally ill, but spiritually afflicted, and that multiple demons were inside him. Over the course of several nights, they performed what they called minor exorcisms with the assistance of local priests. During one of these sessions, Arne reportedly challenged the demon, shouting at it to leave the boy and take him instead. According to Debbie and the Warrens, that moment changed Arne. He began acting differently. He would enter trances, speak in strange voices, and have no memory of certain conversations. He once crashed his car into a tree with no explanation. He stopped going to church.
He became irritable, withdrawn. But life continued, and the possession story faded, at least for a while. By February 1981, Arne and Debbie were working at a dog kennel owned by Alan Bono, a 40-year-old man with a heavy drinking problem and a quick temper. Bono had taken a liking to Debbie, sometimes bordering on inappropriate, but Arne tolerated it, at least on the surface. The three spent time together, both at work and after hours, often drinking and chatting. On the day of the murder, February 16, 1981, something snapped. That afternoon, Arne, Debbie, and Bono, and a few others were drinking at Bono's apartment, which was attached to the kennel office. It was early in the day, but the mood was already tense. Bono became agitated, possibly jealous or possessive toward Debbie. He began yelling, pacing. Debbie tried to de-escalate, and Arne stepped in. A scuffle broke out. Then, in a matter of seconds, Arne pulled a 5-inch folding knife from his pocket and stabbed Bono multiple times in the chest and abdomen. The wounds were deep, fatal. One sliced the heart. Arne dropped the knife and fled into the woods. He was arrested just hours later, barefoot and disoriented. He didn't resist. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He simply said, "It wasn't me." The police were baffled. There was no apparent motive. Arne wasn't known for violence. There had been no long-standing feud. He and Bono weren't best friends, but they weren't enemies either. The scene looked like a sudden outburst, except it made no psychological sense. And then the story emerged, not from Arne, but from his family and the Warrens. They claimed that Arne was possessed by the same entity that had once controlled David Glatzel, that the killing wasn't his doing, that he had been taken over. What began as a shocking local murder quickly escalated into a national media spectacle. Reporters swarmed the Glatzel family's front lawn. TV vans lined the streets of Brookfield and Monroe. Headlines read like movie posters. Demon made him do it. Possessed killer on trial. First demonic defense in U.S. court. The case had all the ingredients of public obsession. The supernatural, a brutal stabbing, and a young man with no history of violence, claiming innocence on spiritual grounds.
The Warrens, already well known in the paranormal world, leaned heavily into the narrative. They held press conferences. They spoke on radio shows. They were filmed standing in front of churches, holding rosaries, solemnly claiming they had warned the church and the police that something terrible was going to happen. They described in vivid detail the moments when Arne invited the demon into himself and how David had been released, but at a cost. But while the public fixated on the supernatural drama, the Brookfield Police Department focused on the crime. They knew they had a clear suspect. The murder weapon had been recovered. Witnesses had seen Arne stab Alan Bono. There was no mystery about who had done it, only why. And for law enforcement, demonic possession wasn't going to cut it. The lead investigator, skeptical from the beginning, didn't believe in demons or hauntings. He believed in motive, opportunity, and psychological breaks. He ordered a full psychiatric evaluation of Arne. Doctors found no evidence of schizophrenia, dissociative identity disorder, or delusional behavior. Arne showed no signs of insanity. If anything, he appeared calm, remorseful, but fully aware. Still, Arne's defense attorney, Martin Minnella, announced that they would argue a case never attempted before. He would enter a plea of not guilty by reason of demonic possession, claiming Arne was under external control and therefore could not be held responsible for the act. The courtroom buzzed. The judge, however, was less amused.
When the trial opened in October 1981, the prosecution moved quickly to block any testimony or evidence related to possession. The court, they argued, had to operate under legal precedent and scientific standards. Supernatural claims could not be proven and therefore had no place in a courtroom. After reviewing case law and expert testimony, the judge sided with the prosecution. The demonic possession defense was barred from the trial. From that point on, Arne's legal team was forced to pivot to self-defense. They argued that Bono had been drunk, aggressive, and threatening toward Debbie, and that Arne had intervened to protect her. The stabbing, they said, had not been premeditated. It had been an act of panic. Witnesses from the kennel confirmed that Bono had been drinking heavily. One testified that he had been belligerent and had cornered Debbie shortly before the fight. But the prosecution countered with medical reports. Bono had been stabbed repeatedly and with force. One wound had penetrated his heart, another his stomach. The prosecution painted a picture of overkill, a loss of control far beyond reasonable self-defense. The jury was faced with a dilemma. They weren't allowed to consider the possession claim, but they couldn't ignore the oddities either. Arne had no history of violence, no criminal record, and no clear motive. This wasn't a robbery or a domestic dispute. It was a rupture, something that came out of nowhere.
After deliberating for 15 hours, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of first-degree manslaughter. It wasn't murder, but it wasn't innocence either. Arne Cheyenne Johnson was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. He would serve just 5 years before being released on good behavior. Arne Cheyenne Johnson entered the Connecticut Correctional Institute in early 1982. He was 20 years old. Despite the bizarre circumstances of the case, his prison experience was uneventful. He kept a low profile, avoided trouble, and worked assigned duties without issue. Inmates reportedly left him alone. Some feared him. Others just found his story too strange to engage with. He served 5 years of a 10 to 20-year sentence before being released on good behavior in January 1986. While incarcerated, he had married Debbie Glatzel, the girlfriend who stood by him from the beginning. The two had remained in contact throughout his sentence, and on the day he was released, she was waiting for him at the prison gate. They moved into a quiet home in the suburbs and did their best to disappear from the headlines. Debbie resumed her work as a dog groomer. Arne found employment as a landscaper. They stayed together for decades. In the years following his release, Arne never reoffended. He rarely spoke publicly about the case, but when asked, he continued to insist that he had no memory of the killing and believed to this day that something evil had been inside him. He never renounced the possession defense. He simply let the years move forward. As for the Warrens, they rode the case into another wave of fame. They co-authored a book about the murder with writer Gerald Brittle, titled The Devil in Connecticut, and embarked on a nationwide speaking tour, retelling the case as evidence of supernatural reality. They described Arne as a victim of demonic transfer, a rare but possible phenomenon where one person could absorb an entity to spare another. The book and tour were controversial. David Glatzel, the boy at the center of the original possession, later came forward in adulthood to denounce the story. He claimed the possession had been exaggerated, if not fabricated, and that his mental health had been manipulated by the adults around him. His brother Carl Glatzel even sued the Warrens and the publisher, alleging exploitation and emotional distress. But for the general public, the story lived on, retold through documentaries, books, and eventually Hollywood. In 2021, the case was adapted into The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, a major motion picture dramatizing the Glatzel's possession and Arne's trial.
Though fictionalized for entertainment, the film revived interest in the original case, bringing it to a whole new generation. Alan Bono, the man at the center of it all, was often lost in the narrative. In life, he had been a manager, a dog lover, and a man with a temper. In death, he became a footnote in someone else's horror story. His family, deeply private, rarely spoke to the media. They never accepted the possession theory. To them, Alan's life was cut short by a senseless act of violence, not by a demon, but by a man who lost control.
They held a quiet funeral in Connecticut and returned to lives forever changed. Today, Arne Johnson is still alive, living a quiet life away from the public. He and Debbie remained married for many years until her passing in 2021. He has never written a book, never sought financial gain from his story. He lives as a man who was, for one brief but terrible moment, part of something larger than himself, something people still debate, dissect, and fear. Whether it was the result of alcohol, repressed rage, mental collapse, or something truly unexplainable, a man died in a small town in 1981, and the question of why still lingers.